He opened the door and found a damp bouquet on the doormat, someone else's grief wrapped in wilted tissue, the stems bent like tired elbows. The porch light was still on. It had been on every night for the last month, a small yellow halo in the same place where rain and moths met. The light fell across the flowers and the wet footprints that led away, toward the street where the cemetery cut a dark tooth into the neighborhood. Sam didn't know whose hands had set the bouquet there. He only knew the way his chest tightened, like a drawer closing on an old photograph. He lived alone now. The apartment had the kind of quiet that was heavy and polite. The television hummed in another room out of habit. The kettle on the stove had been unused for days. There were 2 mugs in the cabinet because there had once been 2, and he kept them both out of a superstition he could not name. The other mug was chipped, with a small crescent missing near the rim, the same shape his wife's smile had when she said she loved him in the kitchen at 1 a.m. He made himself not touch that. Mug Sam was not a man who expected miracles. He was a man who expected the mailman on Tuesdays, a plumber once a year, the elevator to stick in a way modern elevators sometimes do. He had been taken by ordinary grief and folded into it like paper. His days had thinned to careful movements, feeding, the small houseplant by the window, leaving a slice of toast on a plate, watering the geranium on the sill, because it seemed wrong to let the geranium die when he could do the thing that kept it alive. The cat was the first interruption to the rhythm. Not a dramatic, cinematic cat. No sudden confrontation. The cat arrived as small miracles do, late, quiet, and utterly ordinary. He was a tuxedo cat, black like the inside of a coat, with a white chest that looked as if someone had dipped him into snow. One paw was banded with white halfway up like a sock. His whiskers trembled when he sniffed the air beside Sam's door. Sam noticed because the cat sat on the railing like he had been waiting for an invitation. He did not jump when Sam looked up. He sat, immaculate and patient, as if he had been practicing patience forever. There was a slight sheen on his fur from the rain. His eyes were round, not quite reflective, not quite human. They glowed the color of late streetlight. Sam had never been a cat person. He had tolerated neighborhood strays when he was younger, had once fed a mangy dog that used to circle the block, but he had never invited a creature to sleep inside his house. He had been careful in the ways people learn to be careful after loss. But the cat, whom no one in the building had claimed, appeared with a purpose that felt like gentleness. He left the flowers on the stoop. He did not take them inside. Sam crouched and picked them up with 2 fingers, as if the bouquet might crumble. They smelled faintly of lilies and something sweeter he couldn't place. The tissue had a stamp from a funeral home on it, a small scripted name and a date. The date was that week. His hands, steady for most things, shook when he read the name. She lived in the neighborhood, an old woman he had seen on the bus. He could picture her hat in the grocery store. He could imagine the small, tidy chair she occupied at the community center on Thursdays. She had been buried in the cemetery 3 blocks over. He looked up for the cat. The cat's ears turned toward him. He had the air of someone who had simply completed a task and was waiting for whatever came next. Sam placed the bouquet on a side table inside the foyer because there was a place for everything. He closed the door without thinking. He did not imagine this would be the start of anything. He did not imagine that the bouquet would become a pattern or that his porch would become a mailbox for other people's private weather. That night, he slept badly, in a way grief makes sleep unpredictable. He woke early and found a second arrangement on the mat. Small roses, their petals bruised by dew. Again, the stamp from the same funeral home. Again, his fingers found the name on the tissue and registered it like a pulley catching weight. He checked the doorway, then the street, then the cemetery path, and there in the distance the tuxedo cat sat beneath the sycamore watching him. For a long time he watched back until the cat blinked and trotted away as if nothing had happened. He told himself it had to be coincidence. Maybe someone was leaving flowers at thresholds for a scavenger hunt. Maybe a well-meaning neighbor had misread a note. Maybe the funeral home handed out leftover arrangements to anyone who looked lonely. He walked through the days with those possibilities around his neck like a charm. He did not imagine the truth then, how private grief could travel on small animal feet and be left like a message at a stranger's door. At breakfast, he stirred his coffee in a mug that warmed his flat palm. He moved slowly and paid attention to the small details. The way the light crossed the floor, a nick in the banister where someone's watch had caught months ago. He noticed the cat moved through those details like a practiced seamstress, threading himself through corners, touching only what needed touching. He would find him in the stairwell, at the landing, somewhere halfway between being attached and being free. Sam had never felt watched by anything other than memory, but this was different. The cat's attention wasn't accusatory. It was curious and soft. Sam began to keep the door unlocked a crack. He told himself this was to see if the cat would come inside. The truth was smaller and truer. It was to see if anything at all wanted to be inside his life. The cat resisted being domesticated. He would let Sam come close, but always kept a single measure of distance. He permitted the brushing of an index, finger across his head, then moved away. He allowed himself to be in the same room while Sam ate, curled on the edge of the rug like a punctuation mark. Sometimes he would curl against Sam's ankle at night and leave a faint warmth that smelled like the outside. At other times he would vanish for days, and Sam would find himself listening for the sound of paws on the hallway floor with an anxious, unaccustomed hope. This is how bonds begin, not with fireworks or declarations, with small tolerations, with the way a cat lets you believe you are the center for a moment. There were particulars about the cat that made him not just any street cat. He carried things. It was the tiniest, most ordinary thing that made Sam's chest spike. Sometimes when the cat returned from the cemetery, he carried in his mouth the remnant of a ribbon, a single dry rose petal, a small sprig of something the ground shed. Once Sam found a child's plastic trinket, a little red soldier, its paint rubbed thin. He held it up in one hand and watched the cat blink, contemplative. The cat did not drop it. Instead, carefully, he placed it in the crook of Sam's slipper and looked away. It was as if the cat had delivered an offering and waited to see whether Sam would accept it. There was a precise rhythm to these offerings. They were never carried inside while the cat was being watched. He insisted on the privacy of his transactions. He would arrive at dawn, slip into the corridor like a shadow rehearsing daylight, leave whatever small token he had found near Sam's door, and then disappear back toward the cemetery or the alleys behind the church. Sam began to time his mornings by the cat's deliveries. It became a ritual that offered form to otherwise shapeless days. Neighbors began to talk, quietly at the mailbox or over the railings. Mrs. Delgado from 2B saw the cat once and said he had the cleanest coat she had ever seen on a stray. The kid from the corner deli swore he had seen the cat leap fences in a single breath. Sam listened to their stories with the ridiculous private pride of someone who had been visited. He took on the role of custodian almost without deciding. 2, clearing frost from the flowers, placing them in a vase with water he thought would make them live another hour. He labeled them in his head. This one for Mrs. Calhoun. That one for a man who had once taught 3rd grade and hummed off-key. He printed the faces they suggested in his imagination and held them up against the morning. He told himself that the cat was a messenger without meaning. He said the word messenger the way you might say accident to ward off superstition. But every animal has agency. Every small life chooses. The cat's choices had begun to tint Sam's days with purpose. He found himself looking forward to the modest arrivals the way one looks forward to a letter from an old friend. One afternoon, when the light was granulated like sugar over glass, Sam followed him. He had told himself in a dozen ways that he would never do it. He would not stalk another creature. He would not turn kindness into investigation. But curiosity is a soft, dangerous thing. He put on his coat and walked behind the cat at a distance. That was respectful and precise, like someone reading a recipe aloud while another person cooks. The cat moved without haste. He knew the blocks with the gait of someone born to streets. He padded over cracked sidewalks, under a maple that still left half its leaves clinging to branches. Sam kept the distance that would not startle. He felt uncool doing it, like a child, following a playmate. He imagined himself being laughed at in some inner mirror. They reached the cemetery with the quiet of old habits. The gate swung slightly in the wind. There were headstones like teeth, some leaning, some newly raised. The air smelled of ivy and earth that had been turned over in the last rain. The cat, padded between rows, curling around the same cluster as if guided by a compass only he could read. Sam could see now that he was not simply skimming the margins. He approached one particular grave again and again with the meticulous devotion of someone revisiting a ritual. He would sit, head bowed a little, then collect, always something small, never enough to be noticed as theft in a practical sense, and always with the care of someone handling fragile things. Sam saw him take a small bouquet. It had been wrapped in white paper like a pledge. The cat placed the end of the stems in his mouth with the reverence of one who understood sanctity. He lifted himself and trotted toward the street, not once looking back. Sam held himself still, the way you hold breath under water. That night, the bouquet lay on his mat. The petals were stained dark from the soil. The cat sat on the railing and watched Sam bring the flowers inside. For the first time, there was an unguarded stillness between them. Not familiarity, not yet. Something else, an understanding that both of them moved among losses and small necessary risks. Sam began to imagine the lives the flowers came from. He invented a life for the woman whose name he'd read on the funeral paper, a woman who kept jam in mason jars, who had laughed before bed sometimes. He imagined younger hands straightening collars, an older voice that hummed hymns behind curtains. He made the dead into neighbors, into people who had once misplaced keys and had children who called infrequently. Imagining them was a cheap and tender thing, like making soup from leftovers. It fed his need to connect, and the cat, with a single white glove on his paw, kept bringing them. The pattern made Sam's life feel less arbitrary. He began to talk to the cat in the mornings. He would say simple things, tiny confessions he would not have addressed to anyone else. "You're a strange mailman," he murmured once, handing the cat a scrap of fish from his plate. The cat sniffed the fish, took it, and twined his tail around Sam's leg like a soft, slow question. Small towns gather stories quickly, even in cities. People left notes on the bulletin board at the grocery store. Someone posted a photograph of a tuxedo cat on the neighborhood app with a caption that read, "This cat is bringing grave flowers to 3C. Anyone else noticed?" Sam's phone buzzed more than it had in months. Messages arrived with the same tone, equal, parts wonder and a touching suspicion that perhaps the world was not entirely made of cruel things. Through it all, Sam kept the porch light on. There was a particular night that etched itself into him with the clarity of a memory lit from inside. It rained hard enough to blur the streetlights. The gutters sang. Sam had been awake, unable to sleep for the thin reasons the bereaved sometimes know. An old song in his head, the click of a spoon in an empty cup. He saw movement at the edge of the glass. The cat had found his way there, water soaking the tips of his ears, and he held in his mouth a full bouquet this time. Not small remnants. A full, fresh set of lilies, wrapped in that same funeral tissue. Sam could have left it closed like an observer. He could have stayed behind the safety of his window and watched the cat set the flowers on the step. But something pushed him, a small engine that would not be turned off. He opened the door. The cat stepped forward and dropped the bouquet at his feet. He looked up as if to say, not in words but in a direct, immeasurable way, "This is mine to give. Take it." This was not a request. It was an offering. Sam bended. He touched the petals with a reverence he did not often show. They were still wet, with rain and something else, something that felt like ceremony. He crouched so his face was close to the cat. The animal leaned forward and rubbed his head against Sam's knuckles, the way cats do when they mark someone as belonging to their scent. Sam felt something like a breath leave him that he had not known he was holding. It was not relief. It was more like the first exhale after a long swim. He did not think about whether anyone would call this theft or whether he was complicit in the taking. He did not think about laws or ethics. He thought very simply about mercy. He thought about how small, secret acts sometimes become the only language left between living things. He carried the bouquet inside and set it on the mantel. He stood there for a long time, watching the flowers bloom in that small, private light. He felt watched back, not by memory, but by life returning in a fragile, unusual form. He felt the world tilt a hair toward something else, toward connection, toward the slow, quiet exchange that happens between two beings who have nothing but time and each other. He did not know then what the cat had been saying all along. He had only the sense that the cat was delivering more than flowers. There was an urgency behind the small movements that made Sam's skin prickle. He thought of graves, of the way they hold stories like a fist. He thought of the smallness of his own rituals, the mugs, the kettle, the plants. He thought, too, of the way an animal can be the first honest company you find after grief, because animals don't offer platitudes. They show up. They perform small, unassuming acts that rebuild the scaffolding of daily life. Outside, the rain eased to a memory of rain. The cat sat by the door like he had done 100 times. He had the expression of someone who had completed a sentence. Sam sat across from him on the couch and let the silence be full. He spoke then, to the cat and to the room, to the life that had shrunk and now expanded again in scattershot ways. He said, "Who taught you this?" As if the cat might give him a human answer. The cat blinked slowly, with the gracious cruelty of all creatures who know they are loved but will not say how they learned to give love back. Sam put both palms on the small vase of flowers. He read the name on the funeral tissue again. He thought of the woman she had belonged to, of how many hands had wrapped the bouquet in the cold, hands that had no idea where the flowers would end up. He imagined the cat at each grave collecting what he could. He imagined him as a courier between the dead and the living, but not in any classical sense, more like a seam between two halves of a life, a stitch that pulled a broken hem together, enough that it no longer flapped in the wind. That night, Sam slept in a way that seemed to rearrange his insides. It was not complete healing. Nothing that big comes so quickly. But he slept like someone who had been remembered. There was a tenderness in that small act that felt dangerous only because it was so vulnerable. He wondered if the cat felt it too. He wondered if animals understood the human need to be seen, to have someone pick up your sorrow and carry it to a porch in the rain. He did not know. He only knew he would leave the porch light on and that he would clear the mat in the morning and place the flowers carefully in a vase, and that he would keep watch in the way the bereaved keep watch, with a strange, careful kindness. On the bar, table near the mantel where the flowers had been wedged between a reading lamp and a stack of unpaid bills, Sam placed an old photograph of him and his wife on their wedding day. She wore a dress that was too small for the light at the edges, her laugh captured mid-motion. He had not touched the photograph in weeks. He set it down like someone setting a fragile plate in a silver tray. Then he stood, and for a moment the room felt full of living histories like river stones stacked in a stream. As the days drew on, the bouquets continued. Sometimes they were from known graves, sometimes from unknown corners of the cemetery where headstones leaned like tired people. Sometimes they were obvious, expensive orchids, careful lilies, and sometimes they were wildflowers tied together with twine. Each time the cat left them on Sam's porch and waited until dawn for him to take them inside. There was a tiny seed of ending planted early in all of this, a sense that what had begun was not just the beginning of a friendship, but the start of an unveiling. The cat's deliveries felt like a string of breadcrumbs leading somewhere. Sam could not tell if they led to a revelation about the animal, or about the neighborhood, or about himself. He only knew the pull, that small, ferocious curiosity that makes people follow strangers into rain. That knowledge, that something had begun, sat in his chest like a match struck in a dark room. It warmed him. It frightened him. It asked for nothing and everything. He made the coffee and sat with the flowers. He watched the cat sit on the railing, his silhouette black against the gray morning. The cat blinked and then dipped his head and stepped away, disappearing down the sidewalk as if he had been called. Sam watched him go, the space he left much like a held note in a song. He felt the hush that follows any good thing, the hush that is both promise and prelude. He left the porch light on, because sometimes small lights are the only maps you have. He set the vase on the mantel and smoothed the ribbon until it lay, like a quiet oath. He folded his hands and said nothing at all, because the first part of any story worth telling is the part where you let it start. You're here, listening, and that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. They measured time differently now. Sam had once measured his days by the clock on the microwave and the appointments on his phone. Now he measured them in small arrivals, the scrape of paw on threshold, the soft clink of a collar when the cat jumped the railing, the particular breath of wind that carried the smell of earth and lilies. The world narrowed in a satisfying way. It fit into his palms like a warm stone. Mornings became ritual. He would wake before full light, not because he wanted to, but because something in him had relearned how to wait. The apartment had a hush that used to be hollow. Now it was a space where mild anticipations lived. He made coffee. He put a slice of toast in the toaster and watched the way the steam fogged the window above the sink, as if the day were sketching itself slowly. He would leave the door ajar just enough for the cat to slip inside if he wished. He left it that way so often that it became ceremony, not convenience. The cat remained the same distance he always had, a near, never fully attached. He never asked for much. A corner of the rug would do, a place near the heating vent, a spot on the porch rail, where the wood had been warmed by the sun. He gave nothing loudly. He gave acceptance by being present in the same rooms as Sam, by counting his blinks like punctuation. He would sit and look at Sam with an expression that was not human pity nor indifference, but something sturdier. Attention. It was the kind of attention that listens for secrets but doesn't demand explanation. Days shaped themselves around these small exchanges. Sam found ways to make space, to tuck longing into the margins. He began to clean in small, concrete ways. He swept more, carefully across the floor where the cat liked to lie. He bought a small can of wet food that he kept behind the cupboard, hesitant at first to label it specifically for any animal, then later setting it on the edge of the counter like a discreet gift. He would place a saucer of milk outside sometimes, though he knew milk was not ideal. He learned through trial and error the precise temperature the cat preferred for water. Cool, never cold. Neighbors noticed. They started to nod across the hallway, like people who watch a plant slowly take root. Mrs. Delgado would leave scraps of fish she filleted in the evening. A young man from the deli slipped over a piece of paper with a coupon for a bag of cat food. Compliments arrived like small coins. No one asked for credit. Everyone liked the idea of a creature making something human again out of loss. The cat's habits revealed themselves in the patient way. Habits reveal themselves through repetition. He waited by the same lamppost each evening, poised like a sentinel. He preferred certain weather. Rain made him move slower, but it did not stop him. He had a softer gait in the winter, like someone holding himself together against the cold. He liked to circle the bench near the cemetery where older couples sometimes sat, a bench worn by elbows and the small marks of keys. He navigated cracks in the sidewalk as if memorizing the cadence of the city. Sam began to name these rhythms in little ways. He mapped them in his head like a cartographer who has only one chart to make. He would time his day to the cat's arrival, and he found to his surprise that this rhythm pulled at something inside him that used to require other people. He started to go out more, not for parties, not to reclaim a life he had lost, but for small reasons. An errand to the corner store, a walk to the park when the light slanted just so, that let him step into the world knowing he would see the cat again. It felt safe. It felt almost like practice for feeling alive. The cat, slow and precise, began to allow lower walls. He would come closer in the afternoons, when the light was soft and the apartment smelled of toast. He would sit on the foot of Sam's armchair and watch the television not for the images, but for Sam's face. He would lean into the space between Sam's knee and the armrest and let whatever hair he had linger against the fabric. It was a tentative, private consent. Sam responded in the only honest way he could. His fingers became small bridges. He learned how to stroke the cat properly. He learned the rhythm that suggested not dominance, but comfort. He learned the soft place behind the ear that made the cat close his eyes. He learned that sudden, impatient reaches started the cat leap. Slow, steady hands kept the cat. He practiced that patience. He practiced that slow, quiet conversation of hands and fur and breath. Have you ever had an animal wait for you, even when you didn't ask them to? Sam asked no one. He asked the cat, occasionally out loud in the kitchen when no one else could hear him. The question sounded ridiculous and necessary, like a prayer in a language he'd almost forgotten how to speak. Sometimes the cat would answer with a slow blink and the tiny, almost inaudible rumble of a purr. Sometimes he would answer by leaving. A small thing on the mat, a ribbon, a button, a leaf threaded with secrets. Each time, Sam took the gift and set it somewhere that had meaning to him. A shallow bowl on the side table, a jar on the windowsill. And in doing that, he stitched one more hem on the fabric of his life. The gifts changed color and texture as weeks passed. Once, the cat left a child's small toy soldier, its red paint scuffed at the edges, and Sam imagined a child who had lost something and been consoled by their mother in the same way Sam had been consoled, in small, unremarkable ways. Once, there was a wedding ribbon, frayed and soft, that smelled faintly of cedar. Each object carried the memory of a hand that had let go, and Sam listened to the silence those hands left behind. He made stories for each piece, a humble map of the neighborhood's secret points. The cat's movements were always precise, as if there was an invisible choreography he followed. To the cemetery, among the row of stones, then back to the rail, then the porch, then the mat. Sometimes he vanished for a day or two. Sam learned not to let absence unmoor him. He walked the route the cat preferred, not to find him, but to see the places he inhabited. He stood by the bench where the cat sat and watched how the city changed light. He found comfort in familiarity. The bond that formed was not one of ownership. It was not the easy, possessive love that people mistake for connection. It was quieter. It was a negotiation. The cat gave proximity, not possession. Sam gave routine, not demand. Each offered what they could. It was honest. People asked about it, in ways that were both curious and tender. "Do you think he's yours now?" the mailman asked one afternoon, holding the small stack of letters like evidence. Sam shrugged. "Maybe," he said, which meant he didn't know how to claim what felt overlarge and small at once. The word own felt inadequate. The more accurate verbs were tend and receive. Sam found himself speaking more often, not because he had new things to say, but because the presence of the cat made silence less heavy. He read aloud from the back pages of old novels that lived on his shelf. He told stories about his life with his wife. Careful, subdued memories, not overly ornate. The cat would listen with the mechanical gravity of an animal that could not speak, but that could, by breathing, validate. He would occasionally tap Sam's hand with his head like punctuation, a small reminder that the world still required tactile answers. There were tiny rituals they adopted. For example, Sam learned that whenever he returned with groceries, the cat expected him to set down any bags with the heavier items away from the edge, like the cat had some practical sense of topology. Sam would slip a leftover piece of fish into the small bowl, and the cat would accept it with the solemnity of a neighbor being offered a chair. They fell into a rhythm that could be described as ordinary, except that it had recovered something fundamental in Sam's life, the sense that someone noticed his comings and goings. And then, there were the nights the cat stayed. Those nights felt like permission. The cat began to curl at the foot of Sam's bed sometimes, a tentative star, a small black planet with a white belly. He would wake at 2 a.m., feeling the faint vibration of the cat's purr, and something inside him would unclench. The purring was a machinery of comfort that seemed to say without words that the universe still operated on small comforts and that a single tiny animal could be a lever for survival. Trust is not linear. It does not arrive in a single package. It unspools. There were missteps. There were days Sam would reach out too quickly, wanting the cat to be more, to fill a larger hole than was fair to demand. The cat would squeal, not in pain but in displeasure, then leave the room to his privacy. Sam learned to respect the boundaries, the same way he had learned to respect his own. He did not scold himself for wanting more. He accepted the cat's limits and found ways to love within them. The neighborhood began to attach narratives to their small courier. Children liked to imagine the cat as some secret messenger, a furry postman of grief and consolation. They would press their noses to the window to watch him make his deliveries. Old men at the corner cafe placed bets on where he would appear next. That sort of storytelling made the world lighter. It made Sam smile in private when he imagined the cat with a tiny satchel. He found that letting other people add their small inventions to the cat's life made it richer, like adding spices to a simple broth. Sam began to talk again to people he had not spoken to in months. The phone calls were awkward at first. He would say small things, "He left me a ribbon today," and the other person would laugh or say something soft and ordinary. Conversations that had been impossible now slid into place. He reconnected with a nephew who lived in another state, and they spoke about nothing and everything. He realized that the presence of the cat had given him language again. He could mention the cat's habit to a friend and use it as a bridge to talk about himself, about the strange goodness of being chosen by a creature that could walk away at any moment. The cat taught lessons in humility. One evening, Sam watched him on the porch as a group of teenagers came by, loud and blustering. The cat did not move away. He sat through their banter like a small island of patience. When one of the teenagers reached down to stroke the cat, his hand hovered. The cat didn't run. He blinked and turned his face to allow the touch, then lifted his head and walked between the teenagers as if to remind them of coexistence. Sam thought about the old woman in the photograph and the small ways people remembered one another. He thought about how animals could be both lesson and mirror. Time softened things. Grief's sharp edges dulled into something that could be touched, without bleeding. The apartment, which had once been a room of small traps, cupboards he refused to open, shoes left where they had been, grew gentler. He put the chipped mug back in the cabinet because putting things away felt like a courtesy to the life that had been. He started to cook more often, simple meals that produced modest steam and warmth. The cat would sit on the counter and watch the sizzle of food in the pan with the intensity of a person watching a sunrise. Smallness began to mean more. Sam learned that he could be generous in ways he had forgotten. He shared his blanket on cold nights. He left the hall light on for the cat when he went out. He repaired loose boards on the porch where the cat liked to clamber. He learned the difference between doing something because it helped himself and doing something because it helped another living thing. That difference felt important, like learning to polish a small gear in a machine you had not known how to run. They kept each other's routines. The cat, for his part, started doing a thing that felt monumental in the economy of their relationship. He would come to the doorway at dusk and wait. He would press his front paws against the step, then swivel his head toward the street as if listening to a distant bell. For a long time, Sam assumed it was the cemetery calling him, as if the cat needed to make sure the dead were still tended. He followed him sometimes with a quiet curiosity he no longer felt ashamed of. He watched the cat lift a single bouquet from a certain headstone and set it gently at his own paws. He watched him place a ribbon on the mat like a postcard from the graveside. One evening, when the air tasted like the first breeze of autumn, the breakthrough happened slowly and with the kind of ordinary clarity that can only be recognized in hindsight. It was not the cinematic instant that resolves everything. It was tiny. It was a series of small affirmative movements that accumulated until they could no longer be ignored. Sam had been working in the kitchen, making soup that tasted of nothing in particular, a combination of vegetables and patience. The cat came in, as he always did, and hopped onto the rug in front of the fire. He did not pace, he did not perform. He simply sat, round and small, and watched Sam stir. Sam, without thinking much, sat on the floor. It was a habit he had once had. Children do, friends do, old men in parks do, but it felt strange in his own living room. The cat lifted his head and met Sam's eyes. There was a pause, the kind that felt like the universe holding its breath, to see what choice would be made. Sam reached out, not to grab, not to demand, but to offer. His hand hovered, then settled gently on the cat's flank. The cat did not move away. He accepted the touch. He inhaled, then exhaled, the motion like the release of something compressed too long. Sam felt a warmth like a small private sun spread through his chest. The cat shifted, and then he did something he had not done before. He moved closer, deliberately, and curled against Sam's side. It was an ordinary nestling at first, then more. The cat tucked his head into the crook of Sam's elbow and let his weight settle. Sam felt his arm go numb in the best sort of way. He did not think to move. He let the cat be heavy and small and warm. He felt the purr deepen. At this, something in him unclipped. Tears came, not the heaving kind that leave you exhausted, but quiet, steady streams that followed the gravity of relief. He had imagined 1,000 outcomes for this relationship. Some had seemed noble: adoption papers, veterinary visits, the pomp of going to the pet store. Others were quieter: coins thrown in a jar for cat food, an extra chair at Thanksgiving. None of those plans mattered at that precise moment. What mattered was the slow, ordinary proof that trust had been given and received. It lasted a long while that first time. They stayed like that, in a domestic permanence that felt sacred. The cat did not lie as tame as a stuffed animal. He did not stop being himself. He retained the edges of his independence. He left at dawn sometimes. He prowled the cemetery in the evenings. He kept the pulse of the city in his legs. But he had placed something of himself with Sam. He had made a decision that said, in the elemental language of touch, "I will stay sometimes with you." Sam, in turn, felt a new ligament in his days. He could carry his sorrow like a thing with cooling embers instead of a live coal. He felt smaller anxieties recede. The weight of loneliness shifted into a companionable gravity. He walked differently through the neighborhood, lighter in the way someone carries a shared secret. He spoke to strangers more easily now, because he had a small anecdote to offer: the story of a tuxedo cat who delivered flowers from graves. The breakthrough changed the tenor of their interactions. The cat let Sam pick him up once, briefly, in a way that felt like granted permission rather than surrender. He perched on Sam's lap while Sam read aloud from a book he hadn't touched in months. They sat like that for an hour, 2 hours. Time folded into a quiet loaf of presence. Sam felt the steady thrum of the cat's purr under his palm and understood with a clarity that surprised him how much his body had been waiting to be reminded that steadiness exists. There was no grand epiphany, no tidy moral. Instead, there was a revelation of the everyday, that a living thing could, with small, regular acts, pull another life back from the edge of collapse. That grief was not a single shape to be fixed, but a geography to live around. And that company, unconditional, unassuming company, could rearrange the landscape. When the cat finally left that night, slinking out the door with the same quiet that had characterized all his departures, Sam watched him go and felt a violent, tender gratitude. He had been given a fragile citizenship in a world he thought had closed its doors. He had been entrusted with a small animal's loyalty. It made him want to be better in ways that were not performative. He wanted to be someone who could be counted on. He wanted to be warm and orderly and kind, the type of person who could keep a plant alive and a small animal safe. From that point on, the apartment was less alone. The cat would sometimes show up mid-morning, drape himself across the radiator like a small king, and watch Sam write or read or just exist. He would bring a stray ribbon sometimes and drop it at Sam's feet with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done their part. Sam would pick it up and tie it to the mantel, and the ribbon would flutter like a tiny flag declaring their shared, subdued victory. The bond had matured into something that was both a balm and a tether. It tied Sam back to the world in the gentlest way. He could not have predicted the exact shape of what they had become. He could not know where their future would stretch. He only knew that the cat had opened a door, not a wide one, never that dramatic, but a door where one could step a foot through and find a room that smelled faintly of lilies and toast, and sometimes late at night when the city hummed and the porch light pooled on the floor like a watery coin, Sam would touch the cat's head and whisper the thinnest thanks. The cat would curl his whiskers against Sam's palm, and in that silence they both carried something new. The quiet, stubborn knowledge that they had found one another, not to fix the past, but to live with it. That was the breakthrough. That was the seam. It did not break the grief. It made it bearable. It taught Sam how to be held by weightless company, how to let tenderness arrive without grand requests. The cat trusted him. He trusted too in a small, lit way. The world kept being the world, messy and unpredictable. But somewhere in the middle of it, on a small porch, two beings had agreed to keep one another company. They had settled into an unspoken choreography. Mornings were small rituals. Afternoons were lived in the company of the cat's patient presence. Nights held the soft curfew of the porch light and the hush that fell like a blanket over two small lives. And then slowly, like a tide changing its moods, the pattern began to shift. It arrived as barely a thing. A single deviation, so slight that Sam almost missed it. He had been at the sink, the afternoon light making the water look like thin glass, when he noticed a scrap of paper folded under the edge of the mat. It was not a ribbon, not a petal. It was the corner of something that had been intentionally tucked. He picked it up with the fingers that had learned to move slowly and carefully. The paper was thin, a page torn from a small notebook maybe. On it, in a cramped, dutiful hand, was one word. Remember. He laughed then, a short sound that had no other name. He walked to the mantel and set the word against the vase of lilies, as if the single syllable could balance there. He told himself that the cat had been anywhere. He told himself nothing could be that deliberate. But the word stayed with him like a pebble in the shoe. The next day there was more. Not just the flowers. Not just stray ribbons and the occasional toy soldier. The cat began to collect things that were unmistakably human, and human in a way that felt intimate. A hank of yarn taken from a sweater. A small square of lace the size of a postage stamp. A button, old and mother of pearl, with a hairline crack down its center. Each item carried its own warmth. They were not trash. They were relics. Sam kept them in a wooden box he had brought down from the attic. He lined them up like small bones. He would turn them over in his hand and imagine the life that had set them loose. He made small stories for each. A woman bent over a sewing machine, a child dropping his playthings under a park bench, a man who kept a lucky button in his pocket. These stories were not verified. They were, in the economy of his grief, useful. They allowed him to practice making people whole again out of fragments. The neighbor kids thought the cat was playing pirate, bringing back treasure from his nightly forays. They would peer through the mail slot with wide eyes. They began to leave tiny thank you notes taped beneath the mat in childish handwriting. The neighborhood bulletin board filled with theories. Someone was cleaning out attics. A stranger was crafting a private altar. Maybe it was the beginning of an elaborate prank. People like to make sense. It makes fear shrink, but sense does. Not always fit the geometry of small animal behavior. The cat's offerings began to bear additional marks. Sometimes they smelled the way old letters smell, ink and dust. Once, the lace smelt faintly of lavender and the faintest trace of cigarette smoke. Another time, a ribbon came with a smear of lipstick, dark and human and too precise to be a coincidence. Sam kept thinking of the graves in the cemetery. He kept thinking, too, of hands pressing flowers into soil, of someone standing over a stone and saying a name. The pattern did not alarm him at first. It amused him. It gave his days a puzzle to hold. But then an edge formed on that puzzle. Things started to be placed in ways that demanded to be understood, like small knots tied in a rope you did not know how to loosen. Items arrived in clusters, not singly. Once there were 3 buttons in a perfectly straight line on the mat, each one catching the light differently. Another time, the cat left a child's photograph, its edges softened by time, the face in it, smiling as if the camera had been a friend. Sam stared at that photograph for a long time. The child was maybe 5. There was a wind in the hair that the photograph had captured like movement trapped mid-breath. He could not imagine how the cat had found it. Had it been dropped in a pocket? Had it slipped from a grave bouquet? He ran his thumb along the edge and felt the indentations of the paper. The photo had been handled. Recently. He started to wake with a small, compulsive energy. He found himself watching the street more often, waiting for the cat's silhouette by the lamppost. He watched him approach with the calm of an old habit. He watched the way the cat moved, as if following invisible lines that Sam could no longer assume were only in the cat's head. The cat's routes had always been methodical, but now they felt directed, as if someone had given him a list and asked him to execute it with devotion. One evening, as the sun lowered itself into the city, like a slow coin being spent, the cat returned with a softness in his step that Sam had not seen before. There was a crimp at the edge of his ear where fur had been trimmed or torn. He carried between his teeth a locket, small and brass, its chain looped like a footnote. It clinked faintly as he entered the doorway. Sam's hands, which had learned to accept small miracles, trembled when he took it. The locket was engraved with the tiniest letters inside, a date and 2 initials. He held it up to the light, and the initials looked like a private code. He had never seen them before. He slipped it into his pocket and walked to the window, watching the cat pad back out into the dusk. The locket did not belong to anyone Sam knew. He turned it over and over in the hours that followed, like someone trying to decode a language of grief. Sometimes his mind played tricks on him. Once he thought he recognized the handwriting inside the locket. Once he thought the initials matched, the ones on the back of the photograph. He was not sure which of these things, wish, coincidence, memory, made the connection. He wanted to follow the thread, tighten it, see where it led. He had followed the cat before and learned that the creature defended his privacy. He had followed slowly and respectfully and been allowed only glances, never full revelation. But the locket altered the geometry of his curiosity. It was a sign to Sam that there was intent behind the scavenging. It was no longer small and decorative. It was specific and possibly personal. It suggested a narrative that reached beyond the cemetery and into the lives of living people whose names he might not know. He began to sense, in the marrow of his days, that the cat's nightly errands were not random acts of a wandering animal, but a pattern with a direction. One night he sat on the landing of the cemetery steps and watched from beneath the sycamore's thin canopy as the cat moved among the stones. The moon made the headstones look pale and private. The cat navigated their narrow lanes like a priest through the aisles of a cathedral. He paused at certain stones. At others, he brushed aside moss, as if to find what lay beneath. He did not disturb anything large. He worked carefully, gently, as if the world demanded delicacy. Sam, crouched behind a low hedge, watched and felt the old, familiar ache of being an outsider to someone else's ritual. He stepped too soon. The cat lifted his head and flicked his tail. He did not look afraid. He looked annoyed at the interruption of his business. He walked away from Sam as if the man were a gust of wind that needed to be tolerated. He took with him a small sprig of something, thyme, Sam thought, that had the scent of kitchen gardens. He moved with purpose this time, as if following, a map visible only to him. On the walk home, Sam thought about what people entrust animals with. Dogs carry newspapers, pigeons carried messages into the sky centuries ago. But what if, he wondered, animals sometimes carry the unfinished things people cannot bring themselves to bear? What if they were couriers for the private weather of a neighborhood? Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest? He whispered the question to the empty kitchen and then to the cat, who was now curled on the rug like a comma waiting for a sentence to resume. The question was rhetorical. It had no answer that fit neatly on a shelf. Sometimes he would watch the cat with a sort of reverence bordering on superstition. He began to find serenity in the idea that someone, something, cared enough to manage other people's small leftover stories. It soothed him in an irrational way. The gifts became forensic. They came with small, human signs, ink smudges, lipstick, perfume, but also with something more puzzling, snippets of paper with handwriting in different scripts. Once there was a corner torn from a ledger with a quirky list of names. The list looked like it had been written by someone careful and precise, the letters all neat. Another time, A small scrap of a photograph revealed a background that Sam recognized. The old brick wall behind the bakery 2 blocks down. He found himself tracing connections on a map of nothing concrete, like someone trying to learn a language from a handful of words. Then there was the thing that made his stomach drop. A single, small ring, tarnished at the edge, large enough to belong to a woman's finger. It had been delivered with the precision of a ritual. The cat set it down on the mat almost ceremonially, and then sat back on his haunches, watching as if to see what Sam would do. Sam picked it up and felt the groove where a name had once been engraved. He took it to the light. There was no writing. There was only a smoothed curve shaped by years of being held and loved. The ring was not a theft in practical terms. Rings fall off, are forgotten on benches, slip from bedsides. People misplace things in the small, careless ways life asks of us. But the ring felt like a piece of someone's interior life, carried, guarded, surrendered. It woke a sharpness in Sam that made him think of his wife's hands. He felt a sick, selfish wish that maybe, just maybe, the things being collected were part of a larger design that would yield something more redemptive than he had dared hope. Neighborhood gossip slipped into the routine. Someone suggested that perhaps an old resident of the block was dying alone and the cat was fetching things for them. Someone else, with a taste for conspiracy, suggested a serial looter of small domesticities. Theories made good tea-table talk. They made Sam feel less alone. But they did not satisfy the quiet, persistent need to know the why. He started to notice the times. The cat was most active at dusk and dawn, as he always had been, but now there were micro-times within that. A narrow hour when someone placed something on a grave, and the cat collected it quickly before the custodial trucks came by. A period after midnight when the city thinned and people left windows open and small, private things fell out. The cat had the timing of a watchmaker. One night, he followed closer than usual. He kept to the shadows, letting the hum of the city and the soft breath of the hedges fill his ears. He could see the cat move with an almost ritual slowness, paws precise, tail a balancing rod. The kitty paused at a particular stone and crouched. Sam, close enough now to see the letters etched in the stone, felt his throat go dry. The name, carved into the marble, was a name he recognized from the funeral notices he'd read in the paper months ago. An old neighbor, Mrs. Klein, who had been buried that summer. Her stone bore a small planted urn, the flowers gone to seed. The cat's attention focused there deeper than on others. He dug at the soil with his front paws, not wildly, but with a persistence like someone trying to unbury the memory of something. Sam watched him work for a long time. He thought of the seam between loving and reliving. He thought of a mind that might not distinguish between the two. The cat scraped carefully, and the stone shifted a bit, revealing a gap, a small hollow that the cat's swift paw slipped into. Sam held his breath. For a second he thought the cat might find something more than ribbons and petals. He thought he might see a relic, a letter, a tiny box. He had the unbearable, childish hope that the secret would be one that allowed the living to repair a gap. The cat paused. He lifted his head as if sensing someone. He stopped pawing. He looked toward the far edge of the cemetery, where a streetlight hummed like a fluorescent vein. Someone else was there. Not a person Sam could see at first, only the suggestion of movement between stones. A figure shuffled along the path, coat pulled tight. The cat watched as if he had been expecting the figure. Then the figure stopped near the tree and placed something on the ground. Sam felt rooted. He wanted to move, to call out. He wanted to ask. He wanted to be part of whatever was happening, but the cat, attentive and purposeful, had already moved. He trotted up to where the figure had been and picked up the offering as if it were his daily bread. Sam dared to step closer, and the cat, again, stamped Sam with the exact amount of distance he permitted. He did not bolt. He did not hide. He simply acknowledged a boundary and kept his task. Sam realized he was not watching a pattern of theft. He was watching a network of giving. The cat seemed to be a channel through which people who couldn't bear to see their private memorials stay put could still place things out in the world and have them move gently towards someone who would receive them. It was a service. It was a ministry. It was, in the language of the broken-hearted, a small mercy. The question of why moved from speculation to compulsion. Who would orchestrate such careful, nightly arrivals? Who would leave a small token at a grave and ask an animal to be the courier? He imagined, absurdly, an old woman with a list, leaning out her kitchen window at midnight to place a ribbon against a stone and hope the cat would find it. He imagined a grieving father, fingers numb, dropping a child's drawing in, the earth with a whisper. He imagined the cat as a silent, obliging paladin for private grief. Then finally, there was the thing no pattern had prepared him for. It was a Tuesday, raining small, patient drops that made the city smell of wet concrete and wishes. The cat had been absent for 2 nights. Sam conducted his anxieties like a small economy, keeping his routine, sweeping the floor, placing a saucer of water on the step. He assumed absence was part of the cat's life. He assumed a dozen reasonable things. The neighborhood made allowances. People have lives, children, dogs, urgent jobs. The cat would return when he was ready. He woke to a sound like a paper blown along the sidewalk. At first, it was a minor domestic sound, a small tap at the door. He crossed the room slowly, the way you cross to see if anything you love is still, where you left it, and opened the door. There, on the mat, lay something that was not flowers. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine. A parcel. Sam bent down and his breath caught. There was a note attached in handwriting he recognized like a bruise. He stared at it, eyes weirdly dry for someone who had been shedding tears, like weather for months. The handwriting was his. Not perfectly, it had the small tremor of someone who writes seldom, but the letters were familiar. The note read simply, "For Sam." He remembered, with a clarity that made him dizzy, the last time he had written his name in that exact way. He had written it on something he could not reconcile. A postcard, maybe, sent years ago, or a card tucked into a jacket pocket. He didn't know. The note should not have been his handwriting. His mind refused the logic and reached straight for the ache. The parcel was heavy enough to promise something meaningful. He untied the twine with hands that did not obey fully. The brown paper crackled. Inside, carefully wrapped in a scrap of cloth, was a small porcelain heart. It was the kind of trinket people bring home from holiday stands, the kind of thing that sits on a mantle and gathers dust like a memory. But this heart had a name scrawled across it in faded ink. The name was hers, his wife's name, the name he had not said aloud in a long time because it bent him too much when he did. He stared at it until the room spun. He must have known, in some thread of himself, that the parcel would arrive like a punctuation mark between past and present. He must have known that the cat, in his methodical way, had been collecting more than random tokens. But knowing and seeing are different. He had a small animal roar of wanting to be told why. His heart felt like an instrument that had been struck and now took time to come back into tune. The cat sat on the rail, watching him open the parcel, as if it were the most ordinary of conversations. He had a dozen questions, the kind that act like fingers probing a wound. Who had wrapped this? Why his wife's name? Had someone found her things in a box somewhere and entrusted them to the cat? Was he, Sam, being called into something that required him to revisit the past in ways he had planned to avoid? Or was this an eerie coincidence stitched with threads of longing? He reached to the rail and found the cat's collar, a small thing of woven leather. He had always assumed the cat was ownerless, but the collar had a tiny tag now, new and bright. On it was a single word that made his legs almost fold. Messenger. Sam held the tag until it warmed. The cat blinked, slow as breath. The rain ticked the glass. For a moment, everything contracted to the porch. The parcel, the heart, the collar, the cat, and the street beyond blurred into insignificance. Time thinned. Then, as if the world had decided to test him for endurance, the cat did something he had never done. He turned and walked away from the porch, not toward the cemetery, where Sam had come to expect him, but down the narrow alley between the buildings, toward the old railway tracks that skirted the edge of the neighborhood. He moved with purpose. He did not look back. Sam hesitated less than a second. He could have called him. He could have stepped out, picked him up, tethered him. But the cat was not meant to be tethered. The cat's life was not meant to be possessed. He had taught Sam that much. So Sam stood on the porch, the parcel clutched in his hand like a confession, and watched the cat shrink into the haze of rain and the city's indifferent light. He felt a panic rise, small, reasonable, and then, larger, like a day's shadow when the sun turns. It was the first time the pattern had broken in a way that felt like a warning. He sensed the story was demanding a new chapter, and that the cat's action was the hinge. He closed the door gently and sat, breathing shallow, listening to the house rearrange itself around the knowledge that the ordinary had turned and offered him a new course. The parcel on the mantel glowed faintly under the lamp, like a secret being kept in the open. The cat's absence stretched the room. The rails rattled with the distant sound of a train. The clock ticked, small and judicial. Sam didn't sleep that night. He read the note again. The inscription of his own name, felt the porcelain heart like a compass. He thought about how the cat had always moved in the service of small remembrances. He thought of all the objects that had been carried across the city on soft paws. He thought of the name in the locket, the photograph, the ring. He thought about the way people send out ghosts into the world, hoping something will bring back a sign. He had allowed himself to believe the cat was a bridge. Now he realized bridges sometimes demand tolls. They ask for something in exchange. The cat had left a question at his door, wrapped in brown paper. It was addressed to him. It was personal. The cat had been silent for 2 nights and returned, with a parcel that bore his wife's name. That was not a coincidence. He had 100 choices in that moment. He could ignore the parcel and let the world remain in its stubborn grief. He could follow the cat blindly into rain and tracks and whatever secrets lay beyond. He could hand the parcel to someone else and hope that solving it belonged to a different life. He could sleep. He chose, with the small courage of someone who understood the necessity of action, to wait. He would not follow the cat tonight. He would not intrude on the creature's errands, but he would prepare. He would read the name on the heart until it became a map. As dawn thinned, the world shifted. The parcel remained on the mantel. The cat did not return. The city went about its business like it always had. And Sam, with the echo of the cat's departure inside him, felt the old intimate fear that whatever came next would unspool things he had carefully wound into a neat bundle. The cliffhanger lay there like a held note. The cat had changed direction. He had left something intensely personal at Sam's feet. He had turned toward the tracks instead of the graves. And he had a collar now, with the word messenger, as if someone had named a role and asked the animal to perform it. Sam's hands trembled in a way that balanced grief and hope on a single finger. The alley toward the tracks yawned like a new uncertain horizon. He placed the porcelain heart back in the parcel, wrapped it as best he could, and set it by the door. He did not know what would happen next. He only knew that the pattern had shifted, and that when animals choose, they often choose to make the living look at things they had been taught to ignore. He sat on the couch and listened for footsteps that would not come. The rain continued, patient and small. In the quiet, the house felt full of questions. He followed the cat because he could not follow him. It was that simple. Sam had learned enough about small truths to know when something wanted to be understood. He stepped out into the rain the way someone steps into a half-remembered dream, slow, deliberate, attentive. The parcel on his mantel felt like a lit fuse in his pockets. The porcelain heart was warm from being held. He wrapped it in his sweater and left the apartment with his shoes still damp from the drizzle. The cat moved with an absolute economy of motion. He did not hurry. He never hurried. He walked the alley as if he had rights that belonged to the city itself. The rain made the light pool on the pavement. The tracks ran like a seam down the edge of the neighborhood, metallic and patient. There was a smell that came from them at night. Oil and stone and the particular kind of memory that trains carry, the smell of long journeys and small departures. Sam kept his distance. Not because he was afraid, he wasn't, but because he had learned that some acts required silence. The cat threaded through the gaps in the fence with the grace of someone who had done this route 1,000 times. He paused at an old, rusted gate and flicked his tail. Beyond the gate, a narrow path led to a cluster of low houses pressed close to the railway embankment. Smoke curled from a chimney. A light glowed behind a curtained window like a private sunrise. There was a small garden there, in the slope between the house and the tracks, where herbs grew in mismatched pots. Thyme, rosemary, a few daffodils, and something else Sam could not name. The cat hopped a low wall and eased toward a back door that had a mail slot and a handle the color of old brass. He sat and waited. Patient. Exact. He turned his head once, to look back at Sam, the moon catching silver in his whiskers. It was not a look of invitation. It was not a look of command. It was a look that simply acknowledged the other's presence. Sam crossed the yard. The grass was slick. He made no sound save for the soft padding of his shoes and the small, steady thump of his heart. He came to the back porch and saw the light on beneath a thin curtain. The scent of stewed apples and tea drifted out and made him feel unaccountably childlike, as if he had stumbled into the warmth of someone's kitchen at a holiday. He rapped lightly on the door. There was the sound of chair legs moving, a shuffling step. Then the door opened. She was small, smaller than he had imagined. Her face was mapped with the soft geography of many years. Fine lines at the corners of her eyes, cheeks that held the stubbornness of someone who had kept a life together through hands and will. Her hair was white in the places lightning had touched it. She wore an apron with the faint trace of flour, like a badge. She blinked at him, then at the parcel, in his hand, with a sort of warm surprise that made the breath in his throat hitch. "Oh," she said, a small, steady sound. "You followed him." Sam almost said, "Why?" He almost asked, "Who are you?" Instead, he held out the parcel. The woman's fingers closed over the paper as if it were ordinary and precious all at once. She lifted the paper to her face and inhaled, a private, tiny motion. "Come in," she said. The kitchen smelled of apple and dust and something like repair. The light was soft and yellow, as if the room had been made out of safety. The woman moved with the careful choreography of someone who has made a house into a home, folding her life into plain, usable motions. She poured tea into 2 chipped cups and offered one to Sam without looking at him the way people give umbrellas in rain. The cat jumped up onto the windowsill and watched with an expression like a judge who already knows the verdict. "His name is Messenger," she said finally, as Sam set the parcel on the table between them. "Named him that myself." Her voice was tired with an old kindness. "You?" Sam swallowed. "You named him?" She nodded. "Years ago. He found me first. I suppose in that way we belong together." She folded her hands over the cup and watched the steam. "But he belongs to more than me. He belongs to the streets, to the graves, to whatever needs gathering." Sam looked at her as if the answer might break into something simpler. He saw now that she was the reason for the collar. The tag. Messenger. The small word felt like a title carved on a weathered stone. "Why my wife's name?" Sam asked. The question didn't land like a demand. It landed like a stone dropped into water. Ripples moved out from it. He kept his hands folded to keep them from trembling too openly. The woman blinked slowly. The small lines around her eyes deepened. She set her cup down and placed both hands on the table like a ship mooring. Her knuckles were pale. "You know how some funerals have too many flowers?" she began, voice low. "The way you reach for a story that is fragile. Some have ribbons tied to stones like flags. Some have little things pressed into vases, trinkets, buttons. Things people put there and then sometimes don't have the strength to take back home." Sam had been to funerals. He had left flowers. He knew the weight of what people left behind, but he listened because each sentence felt like a thread being handed to him. "For years I kept saying I would go to the cemetery and tidy up the place. I used to work at the funeral home across town. Not as a grand job. I wrapped flowers. I made sure bows were even. I got used to the things people left," she said. and for the first time something like a smile flitted across her face. It was the sort of smile that had practiced itself often and still surprised the mouth when it came. Once their daughter left a charm on a stone. Later, when she came to get it, they were gone. She had been moved. Her daughter had no one. The charm sat for weeks. I took it. I put it in my apron pocket and it stayed there a long time. Some things stay. Some things travel. She paused. The steam of the tea rose like a small ghost. I started asking Messenger to help, she continued. He has a way of choosing. He knows the weight of things. Sometimes people can't come to collect. Sometimes they're ashamed to ask for what used to be private. I thought, if I take the things and keep them, then what? They will sit in a box and fade. So I let him decide. Sam's fingers dug into the lip of the cup until his knuckles blanched. He felt like an intruder in the middle of a ritual he had unwittingly become part of. You were the one who wrapped my wife's heart? His voice cracked on the last word. She looked at him then, not with the cool curiosity of a stranger, but with a precise, almost surgical empathy. No, she said softly. I didn't wrap it. The heart came to me, but not from the graves. It came in a box from the funeral home's storage. We had a lot of items from over the years, things people left behind or things families couldn't take with them. Sometimes families asked us to hold them. Sometimes they didn't. When the funeral home moved a few years back, I cataloged what I could. I found things I didn't expect. I kept a few. I wrapped them. I listened. Then I let Messenger decide what to do with them. Sam wanted to ask 100 small, urgent questions. He wanted to ask if she had known his wife's middle name, if she had known the chipped mug in his cabinet, if she had known the exact cadence of a laugh now gone. Instead, he asked the one question that had been strangling him since the parcel arrived. Why give it to me? The woman's eyes filled with a kind of steady grief smile. Because the cat put it on your mat, she said. Because he felt you. Because he is small and intelligent in ways you and I forget. Because he knows who needs a thing. Because someone who had that heart decided it should find its person. Sam sat very still. The tea cooled between his palms. He pressed the porcelain, heart into his sweater against his chest, and felt the particular imprint it made. It was small and heavy and unmistakably true. He had not expected to feel guardianship return like this. The sensation surprised him with its warmth. I didn't know, he said, the admission tasting like a new kind of surrender. I didn't know I needed it. You did, she said. You did because you waited, and because you kept the porch light on. He notices those small things. So do I. She told him then, slowly, how Messenger had come to be. How he had been a skinny, rain-soaked kitten years ago that she found under the funeral home's back porch. He had walked into her life as if walking into a book already in progress. She explained the small rituals she performed to care for things that no one wanted. She spoke of the tenderness in a lost button. She explained how animals, in their honest way, seek purpose. Messenger had chosen to be one of those honest creatures. There's so much people don't say aloud, she said. They leave it for the ground. They leave it in boxes. They forget names. Sometimes we need a gentle hand to return things that have been left unread. Sam's throat worked. The house smelled like tea and old paper. The rain fretted at the panes. The cat wound himself around the woman's ankles like a promise. He rubbed his head against the hem of her apron and looked up at her with a devotion that settled in Sam's chest like a small coin. She led Sam to a small room off the kitchen. It was not meant to be a shrine, but it had collected the same dignity as shrines. A low table, boxes stacked like old suitcases, bits of ribbon hanging like bunting. Each box had a label, dates, names, notes in her fine script. She opened one carefully and revealed trinkets arranged like a museum of small graces. Buttons, a child's tin whistle, a scrap of a wedding veil, an amorphous collection of things that had belonged to people whose names were written on little cards, folded and kept like prayers. Sam ran a hand over the items without touching them too much. as if handling everything too roughly would undo the careful work she had done. "Were you returning things?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes we wait. Sometimes the cat decides who needs what. He is uncanny. He hunts for the person. He knew you were someone who would accept this. He put the heart on your mat because he thought you might need it to stop carrying the rest of her as if it were all ash." Sam felt the sharpness of a laugh and a sob collide in his throat. He thought of how many nights he had held a solitude like a physical thing. He thought of the mug and the kettle, and of the small ways he had tried to keep someone's memory from evaporating. He had lugged pages of his life like a sack, and had not realized how heavy it was until something smaller than a human offered him a hand. "Sometimes he brings things to people who don't know they belong to them," the woman continued. "I once had a man come years ago who took a marble from a box. He held it and cried. He said it was a marble his mother had lost when he was a boy. That's the thing about objects. They bring you back to the day you were whole. They aren't magic. They're reminders." Sam cupped the porcelain heart in both hands now, and it felt as if the object wasn't just bone and glaze, but the small architecture of his own history. He laughed then, a soft, incredulous sound that held more gratitude than he could name. "I thought it was theft," he admitted. "You're forgiven," she said, and smiled with that practiced mercy that made the room feel like a harbor. "No one is stealing. Sometimes the dead shed things. Sometimes things fall into the city's pockets. We mend what we can." "Who left the ring?" Sam asked, picking up the thread of another mystery. He told her about the ring, the locket, the photograph. She listened and then retrieved a small drawer. Inside, laid out like a cartographer's chart, were the pieces she had been sorting. The locket, a brass circle with initials etched inside. The photograph, smudged at the corners. The little ring, dull with time. She pointed to a note pinned beneath them. "A funeral director came to me a few months ago when they were clearing a storage vault," she said. "There were dozens of things. For privacy, they asked me to keep an inventory. Some of the boxes were labeled, some not. The porcelain heart. That was one of them." She paused. "Sometimes families can't take everything. Sometimes they don't want everything. There are things that are given new stories when the living can't hold them." Sam's hands trembled with the kind of helpless, grateful motion that makes most adult men look like children. He pressed the heart to his lips. It tasted like clay in memory. He felt like a thief who had just been pardoned by the person he had wronged most, himself. The woman, Eleanor, as Sam would slowly learn to call her over the next weeks, spoke gently of the cat's work. "He takes only what will travel easily," she said. "He does not take clothes or heavy things. He brings back what fits in a mouth. He chooses small things. He has an eye for the humanly tender. He prefers ribbons." Sam asked a question out loud he had been turning over in his chest for days. "Does he know who needs them?" Eleanor's face softened. She looked at Messenger, who sat now on the sill, soaked by the rain but regal in his wetness. He blinked, slow and complete. He nudged her hand with his head, and then turned to look at Sam, directly, as if measuring the man's interior. "Not in the ways we think," Eleanor said, "but in the ways animals do. He knows weight. He knows the smell of longing. He knows the way you hold grief. He chooses by proximity and scent and small things we never notice. He knows who keeps a light on, who doesn't. He searches for the opening, and when he finds one, he leaves a thing there." Sam closed his eyes. He thought of the porch light, the way he had left it on out of an unspoken hope. He remembered the mornings he had waited, the way he had stooped, to pick up petals and hold them as if they were letters. He had been an opening, whether he had meant to be or not. Messenger had recognized that. Eleanor poured Sam another cup of tea. They spoke for a long time after that, about small practicalities and larger confessions, about how she had once sewn, veils and wrapped flowers, and how a life like that taught you to see what is left behind, about how she had, in her own old age, found purpose in returning the things that had become loose in the world, about the way, sometimes, a token could unclench a jaw that had been closed for years. Sam told her about his wife quietly, and how he had kept 2 mugs in the cabinet. He said it like a small ritual apology. He told the story of the chipped mug and how it had been too painful to put away. Eleanor listened and nodded like someone who had cataloged sorrow and had made room for its particulars. "Animals don't fix our problems," she said softly at one point. "They don't tidy everything away, but they remind us there is room for tenderness. They give us permission to be held by small things." The cat, Messenger, decided that the moment required an unmistakable gesture. He leaped down, silent, and landed in Sam's lap like he had always done. He did not curl in the polite, reserved way cats sometimes do. He folded himself along Sam's thighs with a trust that felt deliberate. His head found Sam's hand and pushed up against it until Sam's palm came to rest on his cheek. Messenger pressed, then stayed. He stared up at Sam with eyes that were clear and unjudging. He emitted a low, steady purr that thrummed in Sam's bones. Sam's hands started to shake again. The shaking was different than before. It was not just sorrow. It was something that came from being seen in a way so precise it felt like the world had aligned for a second. He put his other hand on Messenger's head and felt whiskers brush against his knuckles. Tears ran down Sam's face, hot and unashamed. He let them fall into his beard and onto his collar. He let the breath come and go, tide and retreat. He could not explain the exact mechanics of what was happening. He only knew the shape of it. He was being given back some small, luminous part of his life. Have you ever followed someone all the way to the place they hide the truth? Sam had not thought he would answer that question. Now, sitting with Messenger on his lap and the woman who had kept so many silent things in the kitchen that smelled like tea, he felt the answer move through him like a tide. "This was for you," Eleanor said quietly. "Not to punish you, not to remind you of what's gone, but because sometimes the living need proof that what they loved had a life outside their memory. People put things into the world all the time and expect them to stay put. They don't always. We are messy. We are forgetful. The cat, he makes small, honest corrections." Sam pressed the porcelain heart against his chest until it was warm. He could feel the glaze have the ghost of his wife's print, the small dent he recognized by touch. He laughed again, a stunned sound, and then sobbed. It was absurd. It was exactly what he needed. He had no words fit for the exact gratitude curling inside him. The tea went cold in the cup, but he did not notice. Messenger nudged Sam's hand until Sam scratched behind his ear. The cat's purr changed. It became a deeper hum, the frequency the body understands as calm. He looked at Sam directly as if to say simply, "I told you." His eyes held no pretense. Sam looked back. He saw, in the cat's gaze, the sum of all the nights he had sat, with the porch light on, the measure of all the small rituals he had kept. He felt the weight of a truth that was both modest and enormous. The cat had been trying, in his blunt and tender way, to give Sam a permission note, to say, "You can hold that heart and still be you. You can let small things mend a little, and that is enough." He had followed Messenger to a house that kept boxes. He had found a woman who had kept small things safe. He had discovered a network of care that moved in the shadowed hours, and it had been delivered by the smallest of couriers. The revelation was less a solution than a kind of opening. It did not make the absence stop. It did not heal everything, but it shifted the nature of his grief from a place of rawness into a place where memory could sit beside life and not suffocate it. He pressed his forehead to the cat's small skull. The cat leaned into him. Sam felt the tremor in his chest ease. He understood with a soft, deep clarity that the cat's deliveries were not thefts. They were invitations. They were the animal's way of saying the world could be less lonely if people let it. He understood that the parcels, the ribbons, the photograph, the locket, the ring, each were threads. Each thread connected him to others, neighbors, strangers, a woman with an apron, a funeral home worker who had kept things instead of discarding. Them forming a net that could hold him without asking him to pretend the weight had never been there. The moment of understanding came like the quiet after a violin's last note. It was not a thunderclap. It was a small clearing in the woods where the light fell through. He could see now the whole design of what had been happening around him. Messenger's roots, Eleanor's boxes, the deliberate letting of things slip back into human hands. He saw himself as one small beneficiary in a larger system of reparative kindness. Sam breathed out. The breath was long and nearly painful in its release. He allowed himself one full, slow laugh that had some grief wrapped inside it. Then he cried again, this time softer because the world had finally given him the thing he had not known how to ask for, a piece of his wife returned like a promise. Outside, beyond the narrow window, the train went by with the ordinary grumble people take for granted. The tracks hummed their old song. Inside, Sam held the porcelain heart against his chest and let Messenger's purr be a lullaby. He looked at Eleanor and felt the gratitude that curdles into something like devotion. "You brought this to me," he said simply, the words small and emphatic both. "You kept it until you were ready," she replied. "He knows when we are ready. That's his job." Messenger closed his eyes. He had finished the business of the night. He had done what small animals do when they are entrusted, with meaning. He carried it. He delivered it. He watched a house receive it like it was a long-lost note. Sam realized then that the cat's small gifts had not just been about the dead. They had been about the living finding their way back to themselves. Sam stayed until dawn. He helped Eleanor with the boxes, making small, dull decisions about labels, and what could be returned through the mail and what needed to stay for now. He told her little things about his life. She told him small stories about the funeral home. They were ordinary details, the kind that stitch people together in a quiet, domestic way. When he finally left the house, the sky had that washed-out blue that belongs to the edge of morning. Messenger walked with him to the gate and sat on the low wall as if taking attendance. Sam stopped. He placed his hand on the cat's head. Messenger looked at him unblinking, and for a second Sam felt the animal's steady soul press against his skin like a stamp. "You're a good courier," Sam murmured, and meant it with a gravity he rarely gave to words. Messenger only blinked slowly and then turned away, as if to say the words were too big for him to carry. Sam walked home with the porcelain heart secured in the inside pocket of his coat. He did not parade it. He did not announce it. He carried it like a secret prayer. The city woke around him. Garbage trucks, a distant radio, the dog walkers moving like pages turning in a book. He kept the light on when he reached his porch, because the woman had said that the cat notices those things. He set the parcel on the mantel and sat down. He understood now. Not everything needed solving. Not everything needed explanation. Some things simply needed to be returned. Some things needed to be placed gently back into a life and then left alone to become part of the air. The cat's deliveries had been a language of return. The cat itself had been an interpreter. He ran his fingers along the edge of the porcelain heart. He felt the faint seam where the maker's tool had scarred it. He felt his wife's absence like a room that had been opened. He felt also the warmth of a hand that had given him something he had not known to ask for. Messenger's head pressed into his palm like a punctuation mark. The cat stayed close. He did not clamp himself to Sam, possessively. He sat with the deliberate caution of a creature that respects boundaries. He looked at Sam with patient eyes that seemed to promise this was not the end. Not of the deliveries, not of the stories, not of the repairs. Sam thought about the first time he had seen the cat sitting on his railing. He thought about how many small choices had led him here. He thought about the woman with the apron and her boxes full of lost things. He realized, in a way that made his chest ache and then soften, that some of the truest intimacies are the ones that come with no drama. They arrive quietly, wrapped in brown paper, left at your feet, because someone or something remembered you. He understood, finally and fully, what the cat had been trying to tell him. They woke like people who had earned the right to breathe easier, not healed, not triumphant, just softer in ways the city would not notice, but the heart would. Sam carried the porcelain heart like a compass for a while, slipping it into his pocket at odd hours and checking it like one checks the pulse of something alive. He kept the 2 mugs, in the cabinet because leaving both felt less like denial and more like an offering. He placed the little trinkets in the box Eleanor had shown him, and sometimes at night he would open the lid and run his fingers over the edges, as if learning the alphabet of his neighborhood's private histories. The deliveries slowed, as most things do when balance is restored. It wasn't that Messenger stopped his work. It wasn't that the city stopped needing small, careful corrections. It was that what had been urgent became ordinary. People reclaimed what they could. Some items found their way back into hands that wanted them. Some remained shelf-bound in Eleanor's little room, waiting. The rhythm shifted from frenzy to a steadier hum. The world allowed small mercy to translate into daily life. Sam's days changed in the same quiet way. He returned to the routines that grief had made difficult, washing dishes with a certain attention, seasoning soup with a deliberate tenderness, answering the phone without pretending everything was fine. The cat's presence, less a miracle, now and more an assurance, smoothed the sharp edges off the mornings. Sometimes Messenger slept at the threshold with one paw tucked neatly under his chest. Other times he vanished for stretches and returned full of dust and small offerings. Sam learned to live with both. He learned to trust the cat's comings and goings as part of a larger rhythm he could no longer command, only honor. There were practical changes, too. Sam began to volunteer, in small ways, at the community center where Eleanor had told him people sometimes needed a hand. He helped with boxes, he learned names, he listened. He found that the simplest acts, folding a flyer, sweeping a floor, pouring a cup of tea, felt like stitches in the fabric of his life. The world had always been full of small stitches. He had been the one to stop mending. Now he mended again. Messenger remained always at the center of that return. He was less of a mystery and more of a fixture. He had a root, a fidelity to places that were not grand but mattered, and a fondness for the porch light Sam kept on most nights. Occasionally, the kid from down the block tried to follow him and ended up lost among hedges. Messenger simply moved on, as if to say, some mysteries are for the living to observe, and some are for those who carry them. He allowed small hands to stroke his flank, then stepped away. He let Sam cradle him when the man needed it. He continued to bring ribbons and small tokens, but he also brought something else. Company in the morning, a reminder to breathe, a living presence that signaled the difference between surviving and living. The final gift did not arrive as a dramatic unveiling. It arrived in the ordinary currency of mornings. Sam woke early, sleep thick in his bones and the air outside sweet with the early breath of summer. He made coffee. He watered the geranium by the window. He put the kettle on and let the house fill with the soft, domestic sound of water coming to a boil. Messenger arrived, as he often did now, with a small skip in his feet and a note of mischief in his whiskers. He sat on the porch and waited. Sam opened the door and found not a parcel but a letter. It lay folded and neat on the mat. The handwriting was not his and not Eleanor's. It was a careful hand, looped, patient, the kind you imagine in someone who writes notes to grandchildren and signs holiday cards with the names of their children. The envelope had no return address. Only in the corner, a tiny pressed violet had been glued like a stamp. Sam carried the letter inside as if it might be fragile for reasons other than paper. He sat at the little table and slid it open with an old butter knife. The paper inside smelled faintly of lavender. The words were simple and direct. "Mr. Harris," it began, "I don't know if you will accept this. I don't know if you even remember my name. But I remember yours. I used to come by with a dog and a paper and you'd leave the porch light on. I was the woman who loved the roses at the corner. My daughter's name was Becca. I found in the things the funeral home left behind a small spoon my wife used to use. I don't know what it means to you." Messenger put it where I thought you might find it. Sam read the letter again. The voice in it was humble and exact. It spoke of children and jobs and the kind of domestic wear that marks a life. It included a memory of Sam and his wife laughing in a grocery line years ago at a ridiculous sale on canned peaches. It ended with an invitation. "If you want to come by some evenings, we tell stories and drink tea. We are small. We are kind. We need the company. Something about the letter made Sam's throat tighten in a way that was not painful. It was a grief that had been portioned out into manageable pieces. He found himself folding the letter along, its original creases, and setting it atop the porcelain heart as if the two might talk to each other. The heart seemed to agree, warm beneath the paper. He went. It was a short walk, the sort of neighborhood distance that has bones like old friendships. He arrived to find a small backyard lit by strings of lights. The woman from the letter, Mrs. Klein's neighbor, as he would later learn, was standing by a folding table covered in bright cloth. She welcomed him with a warmth that felt like being recognized after a long absence. There were 2 or 3 other neighbors. Someone had brought a cheesecake, someone else, a pot of tea. They all had small stories. They all had small losses. They all had, it seemed, been touched by Messenger's invisible work. He told a story, haltingly at first. It was about a chipped mug and a kettle and a late night when his wife had tried to bake something disastrously simple. They all laughed. A small, easy sound that felt like rain. The group listened. When he was done, someone said gently, "The things that come back aren't for the past. They're for the present." The sentence hung there like a lantern. The nights like that multiplied. People gathered with small foods and smaller confessions. Messenger would slip between legs and receive gentle pats. Children ran with foam, swords. The city outside did its noisy modern things, but inside those gardens and kitchens, the rhythm altered. People brought their leftovers, their stories, their photographs. They shared. They stitched. They found that the act of handing a small, remembered object to another person, of telling who it had belonged to, of telling why it mattered, made the object live a second life. It was not merely being returned, it was being remembered. Sam found himself doing things he would not have imagined in the earliest days. Putting a plate on the table for someone who showed up late, learning a neighbor's grandkid's name, saying the name of his wife out loud across a room where strangers might hear. Saying the name felt like a small, honest exhale. It didn't make the ache stop. It did something more useful. It articulated the place she had held in his life and allowed others to hold it too. One afternoon, months after the heart had been returned, Sam took a walk to the cemetery with Messenger at his side. They moved slowly. The air was warm and heavy, with late summer blooms. Messenger padded near the same bench as always, landscaping his route with a casual dignity. Sam stopped at a small stone at the edge of the plot. It was not his wife's. It belonged to a man named Arthur, Sam had learned, who used to be the barber on the corner. A ribbon lay at the base, faded but carefully laid. Messenger paused and brushed the ribbon with his nose. Sam knelt and smoothed it with 2 fingers. He thought about the whole lattice of people who had been stitched together by small acts of kindness. The woman with the apron, the neighbors who kept porch lights, the children who left notes under the mat. He felt the history of a whole street in his hands. He felt the way grief had been transmuted into something communal. "Do you remember when you first came?" he asked Messenger, aloud. "The way you talked to friends on the telephone?" Messenger blinked and rubbed his head against Sam's hand. He did not answer in words. He answered in the steady warmth of companionship. It was enough. The final gift, in truth, had been arriving all along. It was not a single object returned to correct a wrong. It was the construction of a small public, people who met to eat, to listen, to bring things home, and to let go. It was a neighborhood that recognized that objects carry stories, and that those stories have a social life. It was a string of evenings, where Sam watched a little boy put his hand into a box that Eleanor had kept and pull out a tiny whistle. The boy blew it, and the tone that came out of it was unrefined and perfect. Everyone laughed. The boy's mother cried a touch when she remembered the whistle had belonged to her brother. The story that followed stitched them closer. Sam's house, once a place of hushed absence, filled with comings and goings. The geranium, which used to be watered only because Sam felt obliged, grew lush and surprised him one spring. He bought fresh flowers sometimes because he had learned that life is a series of small commitments. He kept the porch light on less out of necessity and more out of habit, because some habits had become blessings. The 2 mugs stayed in the cabinet, and now when he pulled one down to wash it, he did it with a small smile. Messenger watched, as cats do, from a distance sometimes, and from the center of things other times. He tolerated new hands and had new fans. Children named him the neighborhood's official Samaritan. Old men at the bench told exaggerated tales of his bravery. Teenagers tried to befriend him with offerings of tuna, which he accepted with procedural grace. He still brought trinkets. He still performed the quiet work of being a courier for the city's private weather. But he also learned to accept being touched and petted and loved. He balanced the sacredness of his work with the comfort of warm laps. He had, it seemed, perfected his role. For Sam, the biggest change was internal. He could look at the chipped mug and not feel like the entire world had collapsed on its rim. He could hold the porcelain heart and let it be small and whole, not a relic forcing him to inhabit constant grief. He could say his wife's name and let it float in the air like any other name. The past remained. It shaded him, but it no longer dictated the edges of his days. He had been returned to life in increments: a letter, a cup of tea, the smell of soup in a neighbor's kitchen, the lurching laughter of a child. Each small thing built him back. There were days when memory still swung open like a trap. He would stand by the window and find himself needing to feel a hand that was no longer there. Messenger would pad into the room and settle near his feet, a small, living anchor. Sam learned the language of being held that animals teach: presence without words, warmth without expectation, the firm, non-judgmental press of a head against a knee. One winter evening, when the wind was sharp and the city lights twinkled like a scatter of coins, Sam sat with Messenger on his lap and the porcelain heart on the table beside him. He poured tea and hummed an old song that his wife had liked. He thought about the long arc that had brought him here, the flowers on the mat, the slow acceptance, the night in Eleanor's kitchen. He thought about the human tendency to keep sorrow to themselves until it calcifies. He thought about the small courage it takes to place your grief where someone else might find it, and to accept that someone else might return it to you transformed. "You did this," he told Messenger, and the cat's purr answered like a tide. He felt oddly humble, and enormous at the same time. Humble because he had been given back a life in pieces, and enormous because he had the capacity to receive it. It struck him then, with a clarity that was not blinding but steady, that the entire secret of being human is this: we belong to each other in small, unexpected ways. People perform grand acts and call them love. But love is also the small, repetitive economy of living: making soup, lighting a porch, pressing a ribbon into a hand and saying, "It's okay." The final gift had been the network, the circle of people who learned how to carry one another's losses without pretending past. Hurts never existed. That network was not flashy. It had no public monument. It had no headline. It had instead shared cheesecake and a string of lights, and it had Messenger padding between feet like an honest priest. The final nights of the story were marked not by a single cinematic moment, but by an accumulation of these small, ordinary treasures. Children learned that objects tell stories. Adults remembered they were allowed to ask for help. Strangers learned that a porch light might matter more than they knew. Sam found a measure of peace not because the grief was gone, but because he had a community in which to fold it. One early spring, when crocuses pushed through the thawing earth, Sam found himself pulling his coat over Messenger's new little collar. Eleanor had stitched a tiny patch to it, a little woven heart, because the cat deserved the recognition. Messenger accepted the touch with a blink and then twisted away, ready for his rounds. Sam laughed, a short sound that was more like a bell than anything else. He had a small ritual then. Each morning he would set a saucer of water on the porch, because Messenger liked water cool, and then he would step back and watch the cat choose whether to accept the offering. Most mornings he did. Some mornings, the cat would pass it by, choosing instead to walk the routes only he knew. That too was part of the lesson. Not every kindness is accepted. Not every gift becomes what you intended. But giving is its own work, and the act of offering matters. Sam's life continued, small, ordinary, precious. Sometimes he would still find things on his mat, still find ribbons and photographs and tokens. Each one arrived like a line of a familiar poem. Each one required acknowledgement. Each one was an opportunity to speak memory into the open and to let other people hold it with you. He learned to pass items along when they belonged somewhere else, to mail them, to speak the name aloud so it did not become a ghost. Years may have a way of making a person forget which sorrow was first and which was last. That was true, perhaps, of Sam. He could not say which token had mattered more, the locket, the ring, the heart, the photograph. Each had its own gravity. The heart remained always a talisman on the mantle, its glaze slightly dulled by the sunlight. In stormy moments, he would touch it and remember the woman's hands in Eleanor's kitchen, Messenger's steady purr, the neighbors who had shown up with cake and stories. He would remember, too, the small, exact way a community had become a scaffold for life. In time, Sam began to write. Not books, not confessions, small notes, a little column in the community newsletter. He wrote about the porch light and about rituals of remembrance. He wrote about how the simple act of acknowledging a loss out loud made it lighter to carry. People read his pieces and smiled and wrote back with their own stories. The community newsletter became a small mirror. People started bringing him small things not because he had asked, but because they felt the need to hand something to a man who had been given back a life. Messenger grew plump in the soft, comfortable way of cats who have many fans. He kept his work and he kept his independence. He maintained always a certain mystery. He did not explain himself. He never offered logic. He only performed small acts, arrivals and departures, nudges and purrs, that formed the sinew of the neighborhood's new life. Years later, when Sam could look back at the ark and see the shape of it, he would call it a tender rescue. Not because it had been dramatic, not because there had been final catharsis, but because something small and alive had taken it upon himself to be the hinge between memory and life. Messenger had been the lever that moved a man out of the rubble of private grief and into the scaffolding of a community that could bear him. There is a truth here, one that is simple and stubborn. People will sometimes disappoint you. Grief does, not always end. The world will not always offer tidy answers, but the small, ordinary acts, keeping a light on, tying a ribbon, returning a spoon, become the architecture of salvation. They are the comfortable bridges that cross the canyon between solitude and belonging. On a late summer evening, with cicadas fussing like a low applause, Sam watched Messenger weave between chairs on his porch as the neighbors drifted in with coolers and pies. Children chased one another and collided into laughter. Someone read a piece of poetry out loud. The cat dived under a table and reemerged with a small frayed ribbon, his latest modest contribution. He dropped it at Sam's feet and sat, as if to witness the quiet triumph. Sam picked up the ribbon and looped it around his finger. He felt the warmth of people assembled, of chores done, and kindness given. He felt an immense gratitude that had no contest with sorrow. It sat beside the grief like a companionable coat. He breathed in the air that tasted of sugar and cut grass and a faint undertone of lavender. He let the moment be long. He thought of the woman who had kept boxes. He thought of the funeral home, of the storage vaults full of tiny lives. He thought of all the objects that travel between hands. Most of all, he thought of Messenger, who had chosen, out of whatever cunning animals possess, to be a courier for ordinary compassion. He stood and walked to the rail and placed both palms on the worn wood. Messenger leapt up and landed in his lap without ceremony. He looked up at Sam with the same direct, unadorned gaze he had used the first night Sam had left the porch light on. Sam laughed then, a full, unabashed sound. "You've done well," he said simply. The cat blinked and purred. There was no final big reveal. There was no tidy ending. There was only living, the kind that goes on after rescue is done. People continue to live. They rebuild. They do not forget. They remember in rituals and in small acts. They keep a light on sometimes, and sometimes they let it go out. They carry each other through, with hands, with objects, with meals, with company. They use animals as guides sometimes and learn from their precise indifference. They discover that mercy is ordinary and that the ordinary is merciful. And on that porch, in that small neighborhood that had learned to be generous, Sam felt the simple truth settle in him like a well-placed stone. A life shared, even in the smallest ways, becomes bearable. A grief witnessed becomes a story. A story retold becomes a bridge. He picked up the porcelain heart one last time and placed it gently on the mantel, near the lamp that lit the room when the evening deepened. He did not place it there to claim it. He placed it there to show others that things can return, that loves can be honored, that objects can carry memory in ways that heal. Messenger, faithful and limber, leapt from Sam's lap and dashed into the night to his own errands. He would return at dawn as he always did, perhaps with a ribbon, perhaps with nothing at all. He would continue to be both a mystery and the neighborhood's small, honest saint. Sam stayed on the porch until the stars faded. He felt the weight of things and the lightness of listening. He understood the final truth in a way that made him both grateful and acute. Life is not a single rescue. It is a string of small rescues, performed again and again by people and by animals. Sometimes the rescuer is a neighbor. Sometimes it is a woman who keeps boxes. Sometimes it is a cat with a collar that reads messenger. Sometimes it is you, sitting with a cup of tea and a heart warmed by the sun. He turned off the lamp, left the porch light on, and closed his door softly. Inside, the little apartment felt like a place that had room to hold both absence and presence. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat at the table that had watched him change. He felt full of small things, gratitude, memory, the occasional ache. He welcomed them all. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.